Welcome back, everyone. Today, I wanted to do something I promised I'd do on stream, and here it is. Today, I wanted to show you the lore primer, and behind me here, if I just scoot down, you'll see the map of the continent my players are currently on. Now, I must confess, they are going to a whole different part of the world, and literally won't be anywhere near this part for quite a while. So, to say that some of this will become less relevant as the sessions go on would be a bit of an understatement. But it's a wider context of the world they're in, and I realise for a lot of you watching, I've probably been a bit confusing for you because I've not really discussed this. So, to start, over here, we have where they started, in Beijing. So, Beijing is the furthest east nation that is known in this continent. There may be others, but currently that is as far east as you're going to get. It's a fairly, green and pleasant region. I don't just mean because the colour used represent them, but also, the fertile land. It's very... At least some of it is anyway. The more north you get, the less fertile, but towards the south, especially where the party started, over in Seljuan, is very much it's a farming province, so all the farming needs are addressed there. Wheat, all the, every kind of crop you can think of is grown there. And that's because it's a fairly perfect climate for them all. Ground's perfect for it all, and their particular lord was very insistent on doing everything in his power to make sure that that part of the world was, well, that part of the country rather, was actually usable for farmland, as nature and life are something he's quite interested in. And as such, his subjects are mostly farmers. There's some lumberjacks, of course, a few masons, and of course a little bit of metalworking, just for the warriors' armour and arms. But I wouldn't call it a warlike province. However, if you get to somewhere like a bit further up, like Sutan, for example, that place is more of a market area. It's quite a central province, and essentially all goods tend to come into there before being distributed out. Now, you'll probably notice the little star on Bay Celeste, and that is the capital of Beijing. That is where the Celestial Council can be found, and it is a massive mountain stronghold. It is a true feat of engineering of a city, and it is home to a number of ancient metallic dragons. Off to the sort of farther, to the more northeastern regions, there is also a province that is, how shall we say, left alone. Began as how shall we say, a province where a red dragon rules over. The Red Daimyo is often colloquially called. He's part of the nation, but he's kind of just been left alone and allowed to exist because he was there before Beijing existed, and potentially will outlive it. Though there are certainly many in the council who would rather him gone, considering his tendencies to do raiding. As for the general nation of Beijing, to give you a bit of background, there is a very strict caste system that goes all the way from outsiders and mercenaries to the very heights of the council themselves. So, there are a number of ranks. I won't go into all of them, but the ones that are relevant for what you'd be hearing a bunch. The Iron Sim, being the warrior class, quite high up, even more valued than the mages, who are their own class, but due to lack of being trusted, typically the Iron Sioux make up the more trusted and honoured members of society, with those like the Solar being the highest attainable rank a mortal can achieve. These castes are rigid and you don't move up them. You are born into this caste, you will die that caste. And typically, Beijing does not allow mingling of the castes. Unless, and this is very rarely done, unless a dragon has authorised it. If such event has happened, then all bets are off. If a dragon lord has said it is this way, it is now this way. If somehow it needs to go to the council, then the entire thing can be changed, but normally it doesn't. They're very stubborn. Several thousand-year-old dragons don't tend to change their mind on things. As a nation whole, it's a fairly peaceful nation. Unlike a lot of the world, it has very much contained its problem of beasts. So mutated horrors, straight from that one particular dark god, don't infest the region. In fact, cullings are regularly performed to try and deal with any creatures that look mutated. And they're not consumed, they're not even used as meat or anything at all. Pelts, nothing, they're burned. There's a zero tolerance to mutation. Some do get taken for study, because obviously knowing the enemy is quite important, and the scholars do take that away with them. But typically Beijing has a zero tolerance policy. If it looks mutated, it gets killed. Doesn't matter what it is, who it belongs to, it dies. Anything draconic is taken away and dealt with by the local Dragon Lord personally. The same is also the case even in Bigan, as the Red Daimyo does actually agree with the council on the fact that the beasts need to be purged, and will often personally deal with larger problems himself. There's the one bit of benevolence he'll give to his subjects, but he's not demanding gold from them. Now, generally the nation isn't too tyrannical, though let's just say it's not the most... what would be the word I'm looking for? You've not got a lot of social mobility. You're essentially stuck in your role from the day you were born, and also, even if you're nobility, you are still beneath your dragon overlords. To put it very simply, even a noble is expected to do a job. They're an administrator of some descript, they are some form of useful member of society. Even the Solars are still beneath the dragon. It's just a Solar gets a lot of power because they're essentially a city ruler, very rarely a provincial ruler. Normally it's a temporary position, because as far as the dragon's concerned, a mortal lifetime is a temporary thing. What, a couple hundred years? Most of them have lived thousands. So, and in my own setting, dragons are normally older. Most dragons not young. So the amount of ancients is a lot higher than it would be probably normal in the setting. But then, the party aren't too likely to fight a dragon. Well, maybe one, who knows. But other than that, Beijing is quite typical of sort of feudal Japan and ancient China. Bit of a blending of cultures with a little bit of neighbouring countries' cultures mixed in there too. The buildings are very similarly styled. There's a lot of paper used for screens, and a use of alchemy and a lot of magic, with some gunpowder, though the western continent and the nations around there are far more prevalent for that. We won't get into the far west today, as that'll be for another time. When the party get over there, I will probably do a whole similar video to this, but on the Western province, or the Western lands, and all the differences there, especially with Hitara. I have a lot to say about that city, as that will be where a lot of the campaign will be based after they get there, and I've got a lot of notes for that one. Let's just say it was a prior campaign. Now then, if I duck my head, if you see above me, in fact, I'll move myself here. You'll notice just over there the lands of Hugla Khan. If you're thinking Genghis Khan, you are thinking the right lines. Hobgoblins are not very common in the west, but they are very prevalent in the east. Their smaller, diminutive cousins all but exterminated by many. Let's say goblins in this part of the world didn't have a good time. They weren't allowed to infest. One, because kobolds were already here, and they didn't like them. And needless to say, the goblins were very quickly outed. Bugbears are a thing, but are rare. Hobgoblins, though, are in plentiful number. And they've been in this land long before the settlers from the west turned up. As essentially everyone found a new world in the east and went there. And the Hobgoblin lands are not the best. They are very borderline uninhabitable, would probably be the word I'd use. Crops barely grow, animals struggle, except for the ones that eat meat, of course. And needless to say, there are plenty of beasts that roam. They don't bother killing them, they consume them instead. Considering how quickly they reproduce, it's often easier for the hobgoblins just to let them fester. There are many Khans over the years, but Hugla Khan is the current one. And Hugla Khan is... him and his people are very efficient skirmish hunters and fighters. They often utilise a lot of war beasts. Anything from massive mammoths to other more exotic creatures. Even the odd drake if they can get their hands on one. Or a wyvern if they can beat it into submission. But other than that, they have vast hordes of wolf riders and even horses, camels, any kind of steed they get their hands on, really. And most are trained in skirmish warfare. So they will run up to the walls firing arrows tipped with various things to attempt to disorientate and hit various people along the walls of Beijing. They do go into the Kingdom of Nemen more often because softer target, as Beijing's spear and bow gates are connected to a great wall of mountains and stone in between them, and needless to say, going further north is not a good idea. Dragonfire and woolly mammoths don't go together very nicely. Occasionally, the hobgoblins will try something more bold. In that instance, they will actually call upon the help of Oni. Great demons that stalk the lands. Oni in my setting are more demonic, and live in the mountains, and often are much larger than usual. Occasionally, a bargain will be struck, and the Oni will be summoned. These are far more serious assaults, and well, the gates aren't normally manned by dragons, but a couple are dispatched to deal with these kind of problems. They consider it a great concern if those gates ever were to fall, as they are essentially the main protective front of Beijing. The only time Beijing has ever had to deal with other attacks was when it and Nemen went to war. As Nemen is another fairly warlike nation that we'll get to in just a second. But the Hobgoblin Khanate is a problem for many groups, but typically Nemen are the most likely to receive their attentions, as I said, they're a softer target compared to Beijing, and, well, let's just say the Hobgoblins don't enjoy having to smack their head into the walls of Beijing constantly. It tends to break morale. You'll probably notice a small temple as well. That is a, how shall we say, a temple devoted to monks of long death. Jotun is a bit of a rogue temple. They essentially sold out to the hobgoblins back in the day, and ever since train a number of them in the ways of long death. As such, some of the hobgoblin forces do include monks. Not many, but enough to be a problem. Most other monastic groups consider them rogues and dishonourable and, frankly, vile. Though they're hardly the worst monastic group. Compared to the likes of the Weeping Monks, who are more of a death cult. They're better than them, but not by much. Sticking to this side of me, let's shimmy a bit more, we have the Barrens. The Barrens is an icy wasteland, but it was also the site of the Coming. The Coming being the event known for when the beast itself dropped on the world. I've mentioned it a few times. The beast is a eldritch god of immeasurable power. It's able to twist and contort creatures' flesh, body, bone, and soul alike. However, it doesn't even intend to do this. It doesn't even directly control this. Perhaps it can, but it probably chooses not to. For the simple reason, it doesn't find it very fun. Because this god has a vile and malicious intellect. Needless to say, not only is it a despicable creature, but it's also very much a creature that knows what it's doing and how to inflict maximum suffering upon those it does it to. The Husk was once its body in life. The Barrens were once, long ago, a nation in themselves. But when the beast arrived, a truly titanic event happened, wiping out much of the life in the area, and that survived became truly distorted and horrible. The beasts in this part of the world are ancient in many cases, and often have far more advanced mutations, though very rarely do they gain wings. Wings is a deliberate mutation, as most things that the beast's power touches tend to just continuously morph until they are completely just blobs of flesh and teeth. But if the beast has a more direct say in the matter, they'll often start to get wings, because wings let them bypass many defences. And though some nations have counters, Beijing has some balloons, but also has dragons and wyverns. There's a good example. And in the far west, they have war balloons with great Jeziles attached to them to blow things out of the sky or on the ground. Flying beasts are obviously far more a danger, and some get to almost draconic sizes of power. But now the Husk is silent. The Barrens, horrific and terrifying, but mostly covered in the scavengers and leftover mutants that haven't wandered off. Needless to say, though, they are not stupid mutants, many of them that live there still. The despoiler of Filkivir Valley is a good example. Filkivir Valley being named after the nation in the far west. Long ago, those colonists came here and saw a resemblance to home. They probably aren't alive anymore after the despoiler had its way with them. Perhaps many of their corpses now follow it in procession. To go to briefly on the beast, its powers range from mutation, insanity, mental corruption, and the warping of everything around it. The more its presence is felt, the more things mutate. What's quite important is, because it's very much a part of this world now, it can manifest aspects of itself at various places of its own interest. It takes time, but the more it manifests, the more monsters turn up. and as such, the more hell-like the place becomes. Needless to say, if you're seeing the beast, it's already too late. But it won't do anything, most likely. The only documented thing it's done directly, since ancient times, has been to leave a great scar on the walls of Hitara. Though the West is well armoured against the beasts. It was the East where it crawled from. And what it took to kill it was nothing less than divine intervention. But, as many would learn in the centuries to come, you can't kill a god. Not that easily. Moving on to the Kingdom of Nemen. I'll move to this side now. The Kingdom of Nemen was a group of warlike people who came from the West. Barbarians, mercenaries, various warrior groups, knightly orders, and a lot of religious types, a lot of priests. Nemen very much is a nation that had to kind of build off the fact that most of its people were warriors first. This has meant that Nemen has employed less than savoury tactics. The goblins that do still survive in the world, many of them are, in this part of the world anyway, shall we say, are branded with free talons, marking the free bonds of slavery that are upon them. As yes, Nemen is not above using such methods and in fact employs them religiously. No pun intended. It is in their belief that many of the smaller peoples of the world are fit to serve them, and that their diminutive features allow them to do more precise works of architecture and alchemy, and various other more precise jobs. Slowly, the people of Nemen have started doing some of these themselves, but it's often discouraged and seen as unbecoming of a Nemenite. They're often seen as they're quite arrogant people, very proud of their warrior culture, and most by the age of 21 have received at least a few scars via sword fighting. In particular, they take a lot of nods from an old German practice back in, I believe it was the earlier 20th century. The practice name eludes me, but essentially two opponents would stand either side, holding a blade. The body would be covered in a bit of protection, but their face would be exposed. They would not move, they would not flinch. They would simply swing their blades until one's face was cut. To receive such a cut was often a mark of being a man back then. And it was continued all through the World Wars, despite some not-so-savoury people not being very fond of it. And yes, it's a very brutal practice. I believe it still continues in a less bloody fashion nowadays. But such displays of swordsmanship and danger are commonplace in Nemen. A disagreement is quite often an excuse for a clashing of blades. One thing they do have in common with Beijing is their appreciation for the blade, though theirs is more styled upon Western style blades, and less of a samurai look. Though their knights probably look closer to winged hussars, perhaps more so, quite typically. They're a bit of a hodgepodge of cultures. A bit of Poland, ancient, well, maybe a little ancient Rome, but Holy Roman Empire more so. They also do not make much use of firearms. The people are very much of the blade. Bows, of course, are prevalent, crossbows as well. Though practice of the longbow is also considered quite a refined art, and a true bowman or bowwoman is not considered lesser. In fact, Nemen is one of the few nations that has a military with men and women, as there was no room for weakness, so all were trained in the blade. Sons and daughters were handed a sword at young age and taught the ways of the sword. By the time they could read and write, they were also able to kill someone. Nemen at one time was a far more dangerous place, and let's just say a child who couldn't raise a sword was a very short-living child. Whereas now, the country is safer, though Hobgoblin Raiders do change that a bit. They are perhaps one of the more powerful nations of the continent. Them and Beijing often jockey for power. There are some questions as to whether they will push west and take out their neighbours. As, shall we say, their more mercantile neighbours are not exactly equipped to properly deal with them. And, shall we say, is you notice the land difference there? They're not exactly, well, there's not exactly a lot of room for them, so to speak. Now, moving on to said nation, the nation of Jarl is a mercantile state. They are, generally speaking, not very warlike at all. Their lands are quite prosperous, and as such, they are able to sell many goods across the entire continent. Needless to say, they are not exactly militarily equipped like their neighbours, though they make thorough use of mercenaries. Especially from Tarn, which we'll get to in a second. Jarl is an interesting one. They are essentially the oldest nation that was colonized by humans, half-elves and half-orcs. Many fleeing from the west, as back in the day they fled. Such commingling was considered heresy and punishable by death. And many people disagreed with this, and in the West now it's not as much of a problem, but back then there were many who questioned it, as quite a few of the nations at the time, which no longer exist for various reasons, did allow such a thing, but the larger, more powerful ones were very much against it. This is now an outdated view, but again, it's a reason many of the colonists fled, or many were given the option of fleeing. Some simply just wanted a new life. Others wanted to escape tyranny. Jarl was the first place they encountered. It was once a goblin-infested land filled with giant spiders and other horrors. Now it is tame. There are beasts, tragically. And unfortunately, some of those eight-legged fiends are still knocking around, but in far fewer number, and the goblin population is all but gone. Nemen taking most of them. Them and Nemen have a bit of a rough relationship. On one hand, Jarl sells them weapons and armour. On the other hand, Nemen tries to claim their land belongs to them. Jarl does have an advantage, though, on the naval front. They have a respectable navy. Most importantly, they have ships that are actually somewhat capable of crossing the Sea of Teeth to the west. Though done rarely, and only the more high and mighty of merchant society are able to do such a thing. Those who make the journey and live are handsomely rewarded for their troubles by returning with vast wealth and goods of, well, to a nature that just simply can't be found in this part of the world. Firearms of higher quality, which Jarl actually does have quite an abundance of, hence their ability to stay independent, as their mercenaries are often provided such firearms in exchange for their services. Nemen, lacking such firearms, often gets the rough end of the stick when a cavalry charge is repulsed by a very heavy volley of firearms, Jediles in particular. Other than that, Jarl is a fairly open-minded nation. It's people, a very mixed bag, who worship a variety of the gods and very much have a more relaxed view on life, their nation in being quite far from much of the strife. Lastly, we'll talk about Tarn. It is located on the Blasted Land, and to say it's a bit of a hellscape is an understatement. Tarn is a nation that has fallen into disrepair. What was once a very Viking-like culture. Proud warriors, with not terrible land, but still not very fertile, who used to go on great raids and would be about as prolific as the goblins themselves, are now little more than a shadow of their former selves. Many becoming mercenaries to escape their home. The place is vastly overpopulated, with the living and the dead. The land is cursed, you see. No one knows why, but a great curse of undeath befalls the entire land. Needless to say, you don't have a happy time there. In fact, most try not to stay there very long. Most would flee as soon as they're old enough to, if their family has not already done so. But poverty is a ripe thing there, and the rulers of Tarn are very brutally efficient at keeping their people in line and preventing them from leaving. Many who leave are often threatened with death on return. And death in Tarn is worse than usual. At least normally you go to the afterlife. Death in Tarn means you get resurrected as a revenant or some kind of just undead creature. Fully sentient, but devoid of much of your feeling and warmth, as, well, you're a corpse now. Most are put into a coffin and kicked out into the Sea of Teeth by more rebellious sorts in the hopes that maybe a monster will claim them and end their own life. Some, however, will float for eternity. Some will escape and ravage the lands forevermore, slowly losing their minds, as most undead, if they have a mind, will eventually lose that mind. As you might imagine, not being able to feel, touch, warmth, any of those things, any of the senses you'd normally have are dulled and muted. Sight is one of the only things that have in abundance. And even that can go. You would imagine insanity would soon follow. But I think that covers the general primer on the various nations of this part of the world. Other than that, this part of the world is, how should we say, in some regards, safer in places than the West, but at the same time, that is only because the beast has not got its attention on them right now. It has a particular place in mind it wants to destroy, and in the West it has done so. Many places have been destroyed by it. The East has received some of its battering, but despite its body being there, it seems very uninterested. Perhaps one day it will come back and reclaim its physical form, or maybe it'll make a new one. It is an eldritch god, so its power is potentially unlimited. Very few would know. I think that should be a good end to this primer. There will be another one just like this for the West, and I'll have a lot more to say about the West, as I've got more details about it from an older campaign. I do hope you enjoyed, and next time I should hopefully have a video about the session, all being well. If not next week, then I'll actually do that primer for the West then instead. So you will get a video one way or another. Alright, that'll be all from me. Stay safe. Ta-ta for now.